think if it's accurate to say, and I think it is, that that women's bodily autonomy is under as great a threat today as it's been in many, many decades. If that's true, and if we are wanting then to change the trajectory that we're on, I would assert that the best way to change that trajectory, to change the trajectory of the threat to women's bodily autonomy, is to go back and undermine the legacies of those who first sought to take it away. And that if you show that the logic that is being used now to deny that autonomy is flawed at its base or at its root, then it gets much harder to defend.
I'm excited for this one with JC Hallman. Let me tell you about him in a second. Let me first tell you about our sponsors. WeNatal makes my preferred, only single solitary recommended prenatal vitamin for men and women. They make a his and her prenatal, and they also make a great fish oil. It's called Omega DHA Plus. The reason I like this brand is it's small. They only have 3 products. You can compare this nutrition label to anything you find in even the fanciest grocery store, and those other brands going to compare. And there are a lot of brands that are starting to emerge in the direct-to-consumer space that are less commercial, so to speak. I've worked with a lot of them, and I like WeNatal the best. I do. It's only 3 capsules per day versus 10 or more. And because they only focus on these 3 products, they're able to get endorsements like mine, but also Mark Hyman, who has one of my favorite podcasts, but he's also kind of like the face of functional medicine. So they've done their homework. You're going to get all the choline, the vitamin D, the methylfolate. You're going to get everything, all the B vitamins that you could possibly want in this, and which is, not the end all be all to having a healthy pregnancy, but it's certainly a mainstay, and it's an insurance policy on an already healthy, top of an already healthy lifestyle. So I love WeNatal, and they have a special offer for you. I mentioned they have 3 products. They have a his and her prenatal, and they have a fish oil called Omega DHA Plus. If you go to their website, wenatal.com/beloved, and you add any of the to your cart, add a bottle of their Omega DHA Plus, and that will be shipped out to you at no charge. And the other thing I love about this brand is when you subscribe, they're going to send you a sleeve of refills, right, for these metal jars that are nice to travel with, and that minimizes the packaging. When you buy anything from any of these companies you see on Instagram or whatever, you're going to get like a box with a box inside, and there's a box inside of that, and there's paper and stuffing and packaging and all that, and that all gets thrown in the garbage. There's very, very, very little packaging with WeNatal, reflecting that they see the world as an ecosystem. They know you are an ecosystem. They're not going to separate out your parts. So this is this is not a tactic. This is a reflection of what this company values. They also will send you a mind-body journal, which I love. I actually still use mine, even though we're done having kids, because it really reflects that there's more to you than simply this physical body you've been given in order to experience the wide range of human experiences and emotions in the world. So go to wenatal.com/beloved, buy a his and her prenatal, or just one if that's what you're feeling right now, and then add that Omega DHA Plus. You'll get that bottle of fish oil for free. This episode was also made possible by Immune Intel AHCC. That stands for active hexose correlated compound. It's a compound that is found in the mycelia of shiitake mushrooms. And this supplement is a concentrated form of that. So it'd basically be like eating a whole bunch of shiitake mycelia. And while everybody talks about the fruiting bodies, it's the mycelia that really reflect this interconnection of our entire ecosystem. So it's no surprise that it is so supportive to your own natural ecosystem, from your immune system to your nervous system to your endocrine organs. this supplement has worked wonders. And there's one specific indication that has me recommending this to nearly everybody who comes in the door. They have used this supplement, AHCC, in women with persistent HPV who are afraid of the abnormal paps and the painful biopsies and the leaps and the hysterectomies and all of that. They've used this supplement 2 to 4 capsules twice per day for a couple of months, and they have found extremely beneficial results from this. So on top of a very, very healthy lifestyle, adding Immune Intel AHCC is a mainstay of my therapies for a variety of conditions, specifically abnormal cervical, let's just call it cervical dysplasia, right? Or persistent HPV in our female clientele. So if this is something that is sounds like an opportunity for you to start trying to get your health back in order, I want you to go to themedicine.com. That's THEMEDICIN.com. Use code beloved10. You'll save 10% on your bottle. And I've brought up both of these brands, but I am so inspired by having these companies to lean on that when people enroll in my Born Free program, which is a comprehensive program that I built with Sarah Rosser that covers everything in my approach and her approach from pre through post-time access to hours, hundreds of hours of content. We meet up every other week. Once you're in the program, you get access to me, a 30-day supply of his and her prenatals to help support you on that journey. Likewise, with Immune Intel AHCC, when you enroll in the program that I developed with Mimi Lindquist, which is called Clear and Free, your holistic solution to persistent HPV, go to clearhpv.com to find out more information. You also get a bottle of this because it works so well for those women who are coming to us for a myriad of reasons, but namely cervical pathology and persistent HPV. It's all reflective of immune dysregulation, and this supplement will help on top of the long-term plan of getting your physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being dialed in so that you don't have to worry about this pesky thing every 1 to 3 years that you're going back to your gynecologist. So themedicine.com, without the E at the end of medicine, use code beloved10 on to get 10% off your bottle of Immune Intel AHCC. All right, now I had to get that out of the way because I don't want to be over this introduction. J.C. Hallman is a writer, a journalist who took on a very, very challenging problem. He wanted to unpack the story of the man who carries the title, the father of gynecology. And he wanted to give a voice to the women who this man, J. Marion Sims, experimented on in the antebellum South in order to earn that title. Although I think you'll probably appreciate my sentiment that he probably never earned it and certainly doesn't deserve that title after you hear the story of at least 3 women whose names we know and whose names have been largely forgotten in the myriad of different publications and references and accolades and apologizing that people have done on behalf of Sims. So Sims in the antebellum South, we're talking 1840s, started experimenting in the middle of the 1840s with a technique to fix a fistula. Fistula is a false passage between 2 organ systems. In this case, Sims was looking at a vesicovaginal fistula and a rectovaginal fistula. Vesicovaginal is far more common. And to this day, in parts of the world, this is a really, really common issue, relatively common issue, that is a consequence of prolonged, protracted labor. So the idea here is that the tissues are traumatized by a baby's head or shoulders or any part of the body, just compressing certain tissues, leading to a bit of necrosis. And then when that tissue heals itself, it doesn't heal completely, and little channels form, in this case, between the bladder and the vagina, such that urine is constantly leaking out. That sounds miserable, and it was miserable. So Sims, being a young surgeon in his 30s, he went down to the South in Montgomery, Alabama, and he started experimenting on with some techniques, but he needed subjects. And this was in the days where anesthesia was available, not the anesthesia that we know today, but there was nobody to volunteer. Nobody was volunteering for a brand new procedure that when surgery wasn't even a really, really big thing yet. Not everybody was having surgery for every reason under the sun the way that we do it now. So he recruited enslaved Black women. And the problem with that was that, and a lot of his apologizers will say, hey, he did his very best and these women were desperate for a cure in his own autobiography. The problem is that you very, very easily slip into coercion when you're desperate to be famous for finding a cure for something that was previously thought to be incurable, at least at the time. Now, J.C. Hallman, he's done a deep investigation on this, and he actually highlights that there were people who were working on this around the world, and some people actually were probably more successful than Sims, because Sims never really did find a cure. But in 1849, excuse me, he experimented on his first patient, whose name was Anarcha. Well, Anarcha, he claimed she was cured, and he rose to popularity and fame as a consequence. But then the record shows that Anarcha probably had at least 30 more procedures, because this, proclaimed cure was not a cure at all. And she underwent all of these surgeries without anesthesia. And so if you gave a person the option to have surgery to fix something that is highly morbid, I mean, it would be miserable to be leaking urine or stool or both all day, every day. Not to mention that you're supposed to be, you're an enslaved person. You have to perform your duties to your master, meaning you give them sex, you give them children, you have to be productive in labor. And this particular morbidity made it very, very hard for that. So the slave masters were very, very interested in getting these problems fixed. The problem was that these women didn't have an opportunity to say no. They did not have the right to refuse treatment because they were enslaved, even if the problem was as morbid as it was. So it really draws into question, before the advent of modern bioethics, was this consensual? And there's almost no doubt that it wasn't consensual. But the really important piece here is that Anarcha and other women gave their bodies to these experiments, whether it was willing or unwilling, most likely unwilling, and or at least coerced, there's a difference there. And people don't talk about them. So maybe instead of the father of gynecology, we should be talking about the mothers of gynecology. We're going to put them all into the podcast description. And of course, you can find all of the detailed show notes at belovedholistics.com. That's my practice website. That's where you can also find information about my midwife collaborator program. And work with me one-on-one. Excuse me. My online programs are also listed there. If you like this podcast or any episode, please share it with your friends. And if you haven't yet already, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening. And of course, we also are on YouTube now. So go and subscribe there, make some comments. Let's get some chatter going. This is a really, really interesting topic that I think is going to evolve even further throughout my career. But I'm so glad that somebody's finally drawing into question this J. Marion Sims guy, because like J.C. Hallman, when I first read about Sims, I was like, this doesn't really add up. And that was what compelled JC to write his book, which is called Say Anarcha, A Young Woman, a Devious Surgeon, and the Harrowing Birth of Modern Women's Health. And on his website, you'll find an illustrated biography, as well as links to the YouTube channel, which is a web series that he created called the Anarcha Archives. Everything that you're going to hear today is just... I'm just very, very grateful to have found JC and his work, and to have been introduced to his work actually through Shawnee Renee Gibson, Shawnee Benton Gibson, who is co-founder of a movement called Speak, Move, Change, which held an Umbongi, which was an Afrofuturistic trial of Sims and a variety of other people who were complicit in this conversation that we're about to have today. In trying to provide some revised version of the story that lends compassion to the women who suffered at the hands of people like Sims and Sims's assistant, Nathan Bozeman, who at one point was considered the greatest gynecologist in the world. I don't know how you get those titles, but I'm certainly never going to receive it. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with author, writer, activist, J.C. Hallman of the Anarcha Archive. J.C. Hallman, I'd asked you, are you a Dr. Hallman? But you said no, you have like a little bit of a sore spot, maybe not a sore spot. You've got a thorn in your side from the years and years and years of education, which started, I just learned, at the University of Pittsburgh, my alma mater.
Yes.
and led you to Hopkins and led you to all these really beautiful academic centers. You never rewarded yourself a PhD, but you've rewarded other people PhDs.
Right.
And so I kind of want to start off. Of course, what we're going to be talking about here today are the women, the mothers of gynecology, and we're going to be, saluting and sending off into other realms. The J. Marion Sims, who came to be known to me as the father of gynecology, and a part of that, I think, is really kind of reconciling the reality that we have many, many layers of institutions that perpetuate stories about things that are important to our lives, our professions, and the people we care for as doctors. So tell me about that. Like when did that wheel start getting greased, that you're like, I'm not so sure that this corporate kind of institutional way of training and educating others and ourselves, when did that start to become an issue for you?
Well, I'm trained as a creative writer. I went to University of Pittsburgh, and then I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is widely regarded as the best writing school the world has ever known.
Wow.
And then eventually I went to the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University, which was at that time, and maybe still is, considered the #2 program in the world. And so I was definitely like a child of the academic world, at least to some extent. Creative writing was always sort of a black sheep in academia, though that has changed over time. And I think I never wanted to just leap into being a teacher. I wanted a more diverse life than just having been a student and then going to be a teacher. But eventually I did teach, and I was a professor for about 10 years. And in that time period, we're talking about a period from 1985 to 2015, roughly. I don't think it's going out on a limb. I think Noam Chomsky would say this, that there's been a dramatic corporatization of higher education and thinking in terms of being a business. And I think that even creative writing inside or under the umbrella of academia has tended to move in that direction as well, if only because it had to find a home, and it had to talk to deans and be parts of larger departments, and I didn't like that. And I think that probably there's a direct parallel to my uneasiness with that, and
Sure.
and with my tendency to not accept the received wisdom simply because everybody else believes it. And so when I first stumbled across the story of J. Marion Sims and Anarcha, the thing that stuck out to me right away, was that it just sounded like it was full of errors to me, that I'd had, a lot of experience of researching stories at that point. You kind of get an instinct for, when something's rotten in Denmark, as it were. And it comes from that same place, that just sort of suspecting that, an institution can have it wrong. And, and that was in the case of Sims, it was just dramatically wrong, and wrong in totality. And even though when I started looking at the story, there was definite criticism that had come from inside institutions. What I found was there was criticism of Sims. There were his antagonists, people attacking his legacy. But what I found when I really dug deep into his career was that the real truth was even worse than what his harshest critics were saying. It all comes from that same place of sort of suspecting that what has been happening inside of institutions like medicine, like higher education, would inevitably contribute to the perpetuation of a false narrative.
Well, why don't we, for those who don't know, thank you for that. I mean, that's very, very similar to my story, like to achieve what you've achieved academically as a writer, as a chef, as a dentist, as a doctor. Like, you have to just put up with so many layers of, for lack of better terms, bureaucracy, until you're actually able to just decide, here's how I'm going to do things. And this is not an easy topic. For those listening, you can't see us. If you're watching on YouTube, you can. I mean, we're two middle-aged white men who are talking about another middle-aged white man who was hailed as a hero. And to take that. I mean, there were statues, monuments made to this guy, which have been since taken down. I think it was in Central Park, if I recall, there was a statue, or was it in?
Yeah, it's actually, I think it's important to not overstate the extent to which the reckoning that has happened
Yeah,
is ongoing. You know, there was
yeah.
a statue of New York, or a statue of Sims in New York City. There's a statue in South Carolina. There's a statue in Montgomery. The statue in New York has been removed, but the base on which it stood has been left in place, and it has, you know, statements about how great Sims is, and that's still in place. So even though there
Interesting.
is this ongoing reckoning, two and a half of the three monuments that were created to J. Marion Sims are still in place today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe some people listening don't appreciate where this, like what this guy did to earn multiple monuments. There's no monument for J.C. Hallman, as far as I know. There's no monument for me. There probably never will be. So why did this guy, like, tell me Sims's story and how he earned this title of the
Sure.
quote
Yeah.
father of gynecology?
Yeah. I mean, in a kind of nutshell version, you know, Sims was came from modest background in South Carolina. You know, aimed on fame and glory relatively early in his life. Decided to become a doctor because it seemed like an easy way to pursue wealth and honor. Moved to Alabama because it seemed like opportunity. It was the frontier at the time. We're talking about the 1830s. And it seemed
So
like there was
antebellum South. Let's set the scene for people. This is the time during which there was more slave trade activity probably than any other time in U.S. history. So
and
go on.
that was exactly why it was a good opportunity for a doctor, right? You know, because there would be lots of masters who would need, medical attention for the enslaved people that they owned, and so Sims goes to Alabama, and he works as a kind of plantation doctor for a little while before deciding he really needs to focus on surgery if he really wants to make it big. And that was actually considered kind of wrong at that point. In the profession at that time was really more focused on generalists. Doctors were supposed to do everything, and so he was sort of rubbing the dog the wrong way even at that point by deciding to focus on surgery. And then in the early 1840s, he decided, he was like setting out to find, what kind of condition could he cure that would then make his name and pave his way and enable him to leave Alabama and really seek fame and fortune elsewhere. And he did experiments on, enslaved men who had advanced cancers and they needed what was called capital surgery or major surgery at the time. And he did those things very publicly. He was doing a lot of experiments on enslaved babies, infant lockjaw, attempting to find a cure for that. And then in 1845, he was called to the Westcott plantation in Montgomery, Alabama, to deliver a baby in a case of prolonged obstructed labor. And the young woman's name was Anarcha. And as a result of the prolonged obstructed labor, Anarcha presented a few days later with vesicovaginal fistula. And Sims didn't know what to do about that. A month after that, he says he encountered another enslaved woman named Betsy, same condition. And a month after that, so 2 months later, he encounters the third woman, Lucy, also enslaved, also a case of fistula. And then right about at that time, he strikes on this idea for how he might go about curing fistula. And it seems like because this was a condition that had stymied the medical world for a long time, although it's incorrect to say that Sims was the first to cure vesicovaginal fistula, or more properly termed obstetric fistula, as we would call it today. Although he was not the first, there were others. He published about the results of 3.5 years of experiments that he performed on Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, and approximately 7 other enslaved women. Those experiments were performed without the use of anesthesia. They took about 3.5 years. He claimed a success on Anarcha in 1849. Put a pin on that claimed because it turns out that this is not true. He claims to have cured her in 1849, and then this cure becomes really the fulcrum of his medical career. He publishes about his cure, his method, a few years later, promptly then leaves Alabama, moves to New York, starts a hospital there. That is ostensibly, or so it's said, the first institution devoted to women's health in the world or the United States. Neither one of those things really turns out to be true, but that's kind of the and
USA, USA. We just love being number one. Everybody loves being number one in everything. This is not a good thing to necessarily be number one in anyways, but anyways,
right.
continue.
Anyway, so his hospital in New York becomes another venue for experimental surgeries. Now he's experimenting, rather than on enslaved women, he's experimenting on Irish immigrants, claims to make all of these advances and cures and develop all of these tools. Pretty quickly, becomes known as the father of gynecology. When he first started this kind of medicine, gynecology wasn't even called gynecology. But he gets called that. And then, of course, because Anarcha is the first cure of the procedure that made his name, this moment is really recognized today as being sort of the creation story of modern women's health. And, Sims went on to have, a pretty controversial career for the rest of his life. He had many, many critics in his lifetime. But he died pretty much, believing he was at the top of the profession. And even though he had all those many contemporary critics, those voices were largely drowned out by the champions and the apologists of Sims' career that came in the decades later. And it was these people who then did the work primarily of erecting the monuments to him that we're talking about today.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that was a beautiful, even a prolonged elevator ride. That was enough for people to appreciate just how important Sims's work was perceived at the time, and really up until very recently, and probably for many years in the future, we'll still have some people apologizing because of X, Y, or Z. So one of those apologist criticisms of the critics, so this is a critique of the critics of Sims, is that, listen, the guy was doing the best he could, and given the tedium of this type of surgery, the women had to at least have been willing, right? That draws into question, of course, what is informed consent? So if I may just chime in just for a second, because that's what people are going to read. I'm going to put a whole bunch of resources for people to make up their own minds. But if people really want to know a more comprehensive story, which I hadn't known until about 6 months ago when I participated in not even 6 months ago, it was a couple months ago, by a group called Speak, Move, Change. Shawnee Gibson invited me in to play the role of Sims in an Afrofuturistic truth-telling, where Sims is actually sort of on the stand, and he's testifying on behalf of what he did to a collective of individuals, including Anarcha and Lucy and Betsy. But we'll link that as well. But one of the main criticisms or the main apology pieces is they must have provided informed consent. These are women that were desperate for a cure. And I think even in Sims's own biographical or autobiographical work, he said, these women came to me desperate for a fix, and I was the one who was going to do it. So, of course, the issue here is that recruiting anybody and saying, hey, we'll give you a $100 Starbucks card if you participate in our research is one thing. Compelling an enslaved Black woman in the antebellum South and saying, do you want this procedure or not? They didn't really have the opportunity to refuse it. So they really weren't left with any choice. So even if they were like really, really hopeful for a cure, the second criticism, of course, is this could be from the actual critics of Sims. They might say, well, anesthesia wasn't available. And they're right. There really wasn't a lot of anesthesia available at the time. In fact, what I was able to find was that the first real use of anesthesia was back in like the middle of the 19th century. It was at Mass General in Boston, which is one of the biggest hospitals, most famous hospitals in the world. And that was just a couple years before Sims started experimenting, right? So what years are we talking about here? And can you actually elaborate on whether or not anesthesia could have been not only affordable, but also accessible if that were, a part of his counseling, if it were?
So I'll address anesthesia first, but let me go back and address consent as well, because I think those things are definitely related. They are some of the thorniest points of this history. And but again, I think that the deep dive on both of them winds up not reflecting well on Sims. I think that in terms of anesthesia, it is true that both ether and chloroform were experimental right at the time. I think one was approved in 1846, one was approved in 1847, and Sims experiments were taking place from 1846 to 1849. So it's exactly the same window. But so without any other information, we might well say, well, some guy in Alabama, how could he have known about the cutting edge developments that were happening in Boston and so on? But we do know other things, and we know, for example, that Sims claimed to have access to all of the latest medical journals, particularly in regard to fistula. When he first encountered these women, he was researching the condition, and he talked about having access to all of the latest materials, because there were plenty of doctors in Montgomery that were doing publishing a lot and were active far beyond the bounds of Montgomery, Alabama. And as well, sometime later, Sims himself wrote an essay called "The History of the Discovery of Anesthesia," and he himself pointed out that at least when it came to ether, a guy named Crawford Long had been experimenting with ether in 1842 in Georgia. Right. So it's not as though the idea of ether was only something that was happening in the most refined parts of the country. It was happening in other places that were like Montgomery, Alabama. Right. But these were not the only agents that were being used as painkillers for surgery at this time. I mean, the basic things like alcohol would be used to help to dull pain, and morphine was getting used, or laudanum was being used in anticipation of surgical pain, and nitrous oxide, laughing gas, had been around for decades. Sims pointed out that that nitrous oxide was discovered in 1790. And Sims' own teachers, when he was in medical school, were talking about having been part of nitrous oxide experiments in the early 1800s, 1803, 1806. And so, Sims didn't use any of these things on his fistula subjects, and he could have. And in fact, just weeks before he encountered Anarcha for the first time, Sims used laudanum as an anesthetic in a surgery he performed on a young enslaved man. And so it certainly is not the case that he didn't know or didn't have access to anesthetic agents of various kinds. If you're only talking about chloroform and ether, yeah, that's probably true, that they were not widely being used, but there were other options, and Sims just didn't use them. Later in life, he openly said, later in life, he was talking about fistula surgery in general, and he said that for the most part, you don't need anesthesia for fistula surgery. And it was only required when the fistula, the hole, involved the cervix or the urethra. That's when it would be too painful to really perform. So, he had talked about this. But, I've been in the room when fistula surgery is being performed. I went to Africa for part of the research of my book to bear witness to the modern legacy of the fistula experiments, the fistula crisis across Africa. And I saw it. And you can't imagine.
Agonizing. Yeah, I can't imagine.
Yeah, and so, it's still the case that there are doctors in Africa who argue that not all fistula surgeries require anesthesia. Most reject that wholeheartedly, but it's not even really an open question. But there's definitely other things that you can say. But it's the defense of Sims by saying, well, he didn't have access to this, or he wouldn't have known about it because he was a country doctor. That's just not true.
Not true. Yeah.
And then backing it up to the question of consent, I think that one thing that is really important to remember is just how horrible obstetric fistula is as a condition. It is an awful, awful curse on a woman's life. And in Africa today, that's literally true. Women who suffer from fistula today are often believe that they've been cursed, or others believe that they've been cursed. It's horrific. It winds up, women wind up getting ostracized by their families, divorced by their husbands,
Mm,
living by themselves. It's a terrible, terrible condition.
mm,
So it's certainly true to say that any person who has this condition would want to be cured. But the important thing to remember is what this does is it makes you very, very vulnerable to coercion.
right.
And Sims, appears to have made promises he couldn't keep, and he needed to convince these women to offer some level of cooperation. That's true. Just the mechanics of fistula surgery. You can tie someone down and cut off their arm if they need an amputation, right? You can't tie someone down and perform a fistula surgery on them. That's just impossible. So there needs to be some level of cooperation. But what's has to be recognized is that Sims was ultimately pursuing fame and glory and wealth. He wasn't operating out of an altruistic motive. He was appealing to the customers of the enslavers who wanted these women restored so that they could perform additional work on plantations, so that they could breed more enslaved people that would then be mortgaged and make money for the plantations, and on and on and on. That was his customer base. And so he needed these women to cooperate. And so it's only a question of the extent to which, how much coercion would they need in order to offer that partial cooperation? And that could have in a variety of forms.
Right.
So bottom line, an enslaved person cannot provide what we would identify as informed consent. And in the vast majority of times when Sims described it, he didn't even say these women gave consent. He just said he got consent from their enslavers.
Period.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if we're going to take down the statues for Sims, perhaps we can talk about putting up new statues for these women. Let's talk about the women who, through your deep investigative work, I was very impressed by the Anarcha and the Anarcha archive. I actually had heard Anarcha's name, but I didn't realize that you had this incredible video series, which I think is about 22 videos long. They're all 6 to 10 minutes. I mean, it's a short sort of hashing out of probably years and years and years of investigation on your part. What did you find out about these women that was so compelling? I mean, I think it's probably more so their story that really helped you realize as an investigative journalist that, like, oh my gosh, this is actually the story.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about these women. There was Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy are the three, at least in the very minimum, that we know their names of. But tell me about these women and their legacy.
So when I first came across the story, and I suspected that there was a lot more to the story just by looking at the surface of it, at that point, all that was ever known about Anarcha was what Sims himself had said. He was the only source. No one had ever found anything about Anarcha or Lucy or Betsy that did not come from him. He was it, right? And there had been some very valiant efforts to read between the lines of what Sims wrote and come to an understanding of what these women's experience must have been like. But there had not been a concerted effort to actually find anything of them that didn't come from him. And so that's what I did. And what I wound up doing pretty quickly is I found Anarcha. I found sources that that proved that she'd existed. It was even just fundamentally that that basic, that first thing that for all anyone knew, he could have made it up entirely, right? And that includes people who knew him at the time, his assistant who came along right in 1849 and started to work alongside Sims, who started working with Sims just weeks after Sims claimed to have cured Anarcha. That guy never saw Anarcha, right? So she had just vanished, as had Betsy and Lucy and the others. There are other women whose names are known, and they're part of that video series that you're describing. But they were women who were experimented on by Sims and his assistant Bozeman in the years following, between 1849 and 1858. And so I found Anarcha in plantation records in Alabama from 1828. And then from 1841, and then I started piecing her story together, and I found discovered what happened to her. I discovered that she'd actually met Sims probably well before the fistula experiments, when he was suffering from malaria. I discovered that she was working as a nurse at a nearby hospital during the period of the fistula experiments. And then eventually I discovered that she left Alabama. And that she was in Richmond, Virginia for a while, and then in New York City. And she was in those places because it turned out that the so-called first cure of the father of gynecology was never truly cured. It's
Hmm.
standard narrative is that she endured 30 surgeries without the use of anesthesia.
Wow.
There are different sources say have different numbers, but 30 is the one that people generally accept. But I was finding evidence of further experiments in Richmond, Virginia, and then by Sims again in New York City at that hospital that he started there after he left Alabama. And so eventually I was able to track her story to a couple of different plantations in Virginia. And in the end, I found her grave, her marked grave site in a
Wow.
remote forest in Virginia. Not in a cemetery, just out in the forest all by itself. I happened to find the hunter who had found the grave in the 1960s and tipped it up and leaned it against a tree, and he showed it to me. And now there's work going on to make sure that that grave is protected. It's been identified by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. The owners of the land know that it's there. And all that story is ongoing. But the video series, I created the video series and I created an online illustrated bibliography of the book, also called Say Anarcha. Everything's sort of available at sayanarcha.com, one way or the other. The YouTube channel is also called the Anarcha Archive. And I created these things because, as a writer, I'm a creative writer. And so the book is not like a scholarly deep dive that takes you into all kinds of sources. It's an engaging book for a lay reader. It's a history that reads like a novel, but it's all rooted in fact. And because the research was so deep, there was no way I could have possibly included it all in the book, but I wanted to make those things available. And so there are a couple of different forms in which all of the work of the book is available. One is sayanarcha.com and the Anarcha Archive, where you can just go look at all of the citations and you can see I screenshot the actual source for everything I say in the book. So there's something like 8,000 images on that website.
Yeah,
And
it's loaded. It
yeah,
is loaded.
and then as well, I wanted to present it in a different way as well. So I created that short video series. That's sort of, I sort of thought of it as almost as a kind of miniature version of the old Carl Sagan Cosmos series, where I was walking people through all of the sources that I used to find out what happened to Anarcha's life and how eventually I found her gravesite. So that's what that
Wow.
is.
You brought up Nathaniel Bozeman. Tell me about Nathaniel Bozeman. This was, from what I remember, it was one of Sims's surgical assistants who was also a surgeon, and he was one of his primary critics at the time. Can you just maybe tell me a little bit about him and how he comes into this story?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that, as I said, there are many contemporary critics of Sims, and it turns out that Sims' greatest critics were not only his contemporaries and not only his colleagues, they were the people who knew him best. They were his assistants. So both his assistant in Alabama, Nathan Bozeman, and his assistant in New York, Thomas Addis Emmett, went on to be great critics of Sims. And Nathan Bozeman was from Kentucky. He was from Alabama originally. He went to medical school in Kentucky, and then came back to Alabama to practice. And so he arrived in May or June of 1849, right at the time of Anarcha's so-called cure. And he immediately started working as Sims' assistant. So he learned Sims' fistula method, and then began helping with the initial procedures and with the extensive aftercare that the procedure required. And you know, he wound up buying Sims' house and his office when Sims left and went to New York. Wound up feeling like he got cheated on that deal. And then a few years after Sims left, or a couple of years after Sims left, Nathan Bozeman started to work on improvements to Sims' fistula cure. And he published about that, had amazing things to say about Sims, but then said, you know, this cure that he created for this, it really doesn't work all that well. It only works about half the time, truth be told, because Sims had said it was perfect when he published about
Right.
it. Right.
Right.
Everything was perfect. We have a kind of very clear analog these days for a guy who just constantly says perfect. And Sims was exactly like that. And so Bozeman published, you know, and he was trying to do like the normal scientist thing. You know, you pay homage to you know, the person that you know, your mentor, but then you're gonna like announce that you've made an improvement and that people should know about that. And Sims absolutely flipped out. And it wound up being this massive feud. And then they were basically never reconciled after that. And interestingly, just a couple of years, you know, one of the things that is still said about Sims today, those apologists who will still stand up and defend Sims, they'll say, well, he was the first to cure fistula. That's not true. There were plenty of others. There was Haywood in Boston, and there was, you know, a guy named Simon in Germany, and there were others in the United States. There was Gossett in England, and they'd all been doing this, but Sims had taken credit for this. But his procedure, which he published in 1852, he cures Anarcha in 1849, publishes his procedure in 1852. Bozeman comes along and criticizes it. And then in 1856, Sims' procedure, published 4 years earlier, is completely abandoned. It's just gone.
Wow.
And so even today, they say, oh yeah, he was the guy who cured fistula. No, he had a procedure that was abandoned within half a dozen years of when he published about it. So how he goes then to become the father of gynecology, that's just a marketing branding ploy. That has nothing to do with what he actually contributed to the world in terms of medicine.
Sure.
Bozeman knew that. You know, Bozeman was right there. And so, you know, Bozeman actually, he took his method and he traveled to Europe first, and started talking about his methodology for curing the same condition. Bozeman was actually called the greatest gynecologist in the world before Sims was called the father of gynecology. But they had these dueling personalities that persisted for decades. Bozeman eventually followed Sims to New York and wound up working at the same hospital, which must have been very awkward.
It must have been very weird.
Yeah. And Bozeman never stopped criticizing Sims. And even when Sims died, Bozeman immediately published, you know, this very, very substantial article about Sims' fistula cure and why it was abandoned by the profession. And you know, Bozeman was shrieking from the rooftops about how Sims' career was pretty much a sham. And he wasn't alone. But the truth is that the Sims apologists shrieked even louder, and they were willing to engage in outright propaganda in terms of celebrating Sims' career and really, literally turning him into a godlike figure. You know, and so when we think now about doctors and the God complex, you know,
know it all too well.
it is so literal in the 19th century, the way that doctors convinced themselves that they were God's most perfect instrument, and that, you know, that divine will could be, you know, measured through what people were discovering in terms of science, and you know, and that these guys were divine, right?
Yeah.
And that was very, very literal in Sims' case, and his champions just yelled louder and longer than his critics did. And then eventually, the critics, they were the kinds of doctors who ultimately were the sort of physicians who were arguing on behalf of a humbler profession in general. So it's probably not a surprise that their voices got drowned out over time.
Sure.
And then so early in the 20th century, we wound up with this outrageous caricature of J. Marion Sims as this heroic medical pioneer,
Mm.
and he just wasn't, and that is what stuck around until really the 1960s, when the reevaluation of Sims' career began. With the work of, a couple of scholars, a guy named G.J. Barker Benfield wrote a book
Mm.
that was important in the 60s. There was another in the 80s by a woman named Deborah Kuhn McGregor. These were important books, but they remained a very, kind of scholarly curiosity. And then Harriet Washington, in her book Medical Apartheid, made Sims a kind of fulcrum figure for her very, very wide-ranging book
Sure.
on all forms of medical experimentation on African Americans. And that really, triggered a major reevaluation of Sims, and inspired people to start objecting to that New York monument.
Yeah.
And so that at least in terms of the modern reevaluation of Sims' legacy, it really starts right then. But then when I came along, ultimately, J. Marion Sims was a small part of Harriet Washington's book because her book was so wide ranging.
Sure.
So what that meant was that there was room, for a very, very deep dive into Sims' career, specifically to try to elucidate his true motives and begin to chip away at that false facade. But then also, to excavate the story of Anarcha, to find her and figure out how to tell her story. There was room for
Yeah.
that. So that's what I
Yeah.
set out to do.
I'm thinking back to the mid 19th century. We had a very Protestant population and Catholic population. I mean, we had a very, very Christian South, and I mean, really the entire country. But in your investigation, did you find that this guy had was he a devout Christian, or like what was his? He must have seen this as problematic and used some way to justify it, even in the eyes of God. So I'm curious what you found out about that, if
Yeah,
anything.
I mean, I think that it's a little tricky because he was a churchgoer. I think his wife was probably more churchy than he was, but he does sort of start talking about this in terms of his career, believing that God has invested him with some kind of purpose, right? He's on a mission from God, like the blues man.
Sure. Sure.
And and so and then the way that he then tells his stories, right? That his stories of the medical advances that he made, there's the same pattern in each time. It's like, well, I saw one patient who had this, and then I saw another, and then I saw another, and then it came to me how I would cure them all, right? And this happens several times during the 50 years of his career. And as he describes them, they are big, elaborate descriptions that read like religious revelations, right?
Mm,
And
mm.
he's always there careful to say, well, this is just God working through me in some way. I have been the recipient of a divine will. I saw the light, and I guess I'm still kind of undecided whether that was genuine in him, or whether he was consciously using that to appeal to an audience that would perceive,
Oh, yeah.
that his story was more valid if it appeared like it was really God's will and not just some guy trying to,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And in your archive, we won't go in your book, we won't go into this now, but there was a myriad of personal reasons that this guy wanted to show how great he was, from trying to impress the woman he was courting, her family, to wanting to be, of course, respected within his profession, which has not changed much today. But I have two more questions for you. And the first is, we're going to end with reactions to your work, because you mentioned, was it Bernkamp? I can never remember the title of that book from the 60s. Bernkamp, was that his last name? The author of the original book?
Barker
That was
Benfield.
Benfield. Sorry, Benfield. I don't know why I always want to call him Bernkamp, but I haven't read Benfield's book. But from what I remember, the response to that book was, it was pretty awful stuff were thrown his way. So we'll save that for the very, very end. I'm curious if you've got a similar response. But going back to Harriet Washington's book, which for anybody listening, if you missed it, we'll put a link in the show notes, Medical Apartheid. And it really gets into the dark side of medical experimentation, everything from Sims's time through Tuskegee and all of the bioethical barriers that we have that we have now put into place in order to prevent this type of stuff from happening. But I want to ask you, why does this matter? Like, why does it matter that we called this guy? So he made a mistake, big deal. Why does it matter that we actually look back this far ago at the advent? And by the way, guys, this is before the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. This is before the profession of gynecology was established. Why is it important that we start at the root if we want to see anything different in the future? It's a leading question, but I want to hear your answer.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if it's accurate to say, and I think it is, that, that women's bodily autonomy is under a greater threat today as it's been in many, many decades. If that's true, and if we are wanting then to change the trajectory that we're on, I would assert that the best way to change that trajectory, to change the trajectory of the threat to women's bodily autonomy, is to go back and undermine the legacies of those who first sought to take it away. And that if you show that the logic that is being used now to deny that autonomy is flawed at its base or at its root, then it gets much harder to defend. And I think as well, when you look at the Sims monuments that continue to exist, there are no monuments to Jonas Salk, for example. There are monuments to the fight against polio, but Jonas Salk has no standalone, statues celebrating him. That's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, because Jonas, he gave up $3 billion in profits that he could have realized from the polio vaccine. Sims just desperately tried to get rich. Yeah. And so I think that, the monuments continue to stand as a testament that deceit and duplicity wins. And particularly inside the medical community, it's not like we're at a shortage of doctors even today who appear to believe that they can use medical experimentation to pursue fame and wealth and glory. And as long as those monuments are standing, who's to tell them that they're wrong? And several, like Paolo Macchiarini, for example, has been subjected to very harsh criticism, and there are others who've been caught. But how many have not, right? And how many of those people are looking at somebody like Sims and saying, well, maybe I can get away with it too. And, furthermore, think of Black vaccine hesitancy during COVID.
Yeah.
When as long as those monuments are standing, people who have concerns about how the medical world has treated them historically, those concerns are going to be perfectly valid. And that constitutes a public health hazard, right? So I think that why it matters is that there are ongoing life and death questions that result from the fact that we have this fraudulent figure at the head of a whole precinct of medical practice.
I would agree. I mean, I even think when we consider the amount of coercive language used in childbirth, nowadays, where something as simple as, you don't want your baby to die, right? Like, that doesn't really give a person a reasonable out, the right to refuse the intervention. Now, maybe the doctor is right. Like, I am desperate to not have this baby die. I'm telling you, this is what I would do if it was my wife, whatever. But it's usually like, hey, you know what? Let's just call it what it is. The baby's not coming out. We don't want your baby to die, do you? That's a coercive way of communicating. And when we consider, I'm just adding to your incredible, eloquent answer here. When we consider that we have been unable until maybe the 60s, and it continues on today, to look at the father of gynecology. If he's going to hold the title, that should be the model for how I'm going to provide care. And I reject his fatherhood because he didn't model for me how I would like to take care of people. Right. And so is there some other way that we could frame his work and maybe try to find a way to reassert that power? Like, let's shift that power to the women who actually desperately require somebody to say their name, say Anarcha,
Right.
because we can. Yeah, go ahead.
That's ultimately the goal of the book. The goal of the book was to redirect credit, for this part of the history, recognizing that Sims didn't really offer anything clinically that produced, results in the real world. A lot of, doctors may cringe at hearing that because, they've believed for decades that things this guy did were important, tools or devices or whatever. And it's just all not true, and you would have to knock those down one at a time, but I would encourage anybody who still has some kind of fealty to Sims to go read the book, that provide all the evidence for why everything this guy was said to have done turns out to either have been debunked or to have been the work of other doctors.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, to recognize that the real heroes of this story were the women that he experimented on. And
that's right.
To my mind, all of those women are symbolized by the experience of Anarcha. Anarcha, in the way I tell her story, is ultimately a symbol, and the way that I tell her story, the version of Anarcha that I deliver, is a vast improvement on the version that we had that just came from Sims' fraudulent fictional history, a fraudulent fictional history that stood as objective history for 170 years.
Amen. Yeah, I love that. I'm going to find time. One final question. When you started writing about this stuff, given that you were going into some deep archives in the South and you were bringing up stuff from the past, was the response positive or negative or neutral whenever you published some of your work?
I think it was, the vast majority, it was very, very positive, and I think you see this in the reviews of the book. I don't think that means that is unqualifiedly so. I mean, I think that particularly doctors who have that ongoing fealty or loyalty to Sims' career may just have a knee-jerk reaction. They're just going to assume that this is some kind of woke over reaction and it's all going to blow over in decades. And weirdly, they might actually wind up proving to be right, because it could be the case that in 30 or 40 years, they decide to put Sims' monument back up in New York City. Right. And so I think that this fight is never over. And, but I think for those who have looked at the book, and who have gotten a sense of just how deep the research is, what I've encountered the vast majority of the time is just appreciation for having, having decided to undertake that deep dive, which at no point was easy. It was hard, and that's why it hadn't been done, in many decades, even as people were reevaluating that career. The extent to which where the work was going to go was going to take a long time and really required sort of effort. And I think that once people get a sense of that, then they're ready for the book, and I think that the vast majority of the time people have responded very positively.
I hope everybody goes, and if you don't like reading, go to YouTube. We're going to put Anarcha Archive. It's ANARCHA archive.com. You can find the illustrated bibliography. You can find additional bonus videos. You can find everything that's on YouTube there. You can buy the book there. We'll put this and more in the podcast description. JC, thank you. I know you're traveling. I appreciate you taking some time out for me. This is going to be a very exciting episode to bring to my audience. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Anytime.